The dog had been at the door for 11 minutes. That was the first thing Mace Dillon noticed when he pulled the truck into the gravel lot of Harkin's Fuel and Feed, the only gas station on Route 9 between Corrigan Falls and the county line. Closed sign in the window, lights off inside. The German shepherd, Rook, was pressed against the glass door of the entrance with both front paws up, head low, shoulders rigid, not barking, not whining, just pushing. Like something on the other side had asked him to come in. Mace sat in the cab for a moment and watched. He had driven this stretch of highway enough times in the past 3 weeks to know that Harkins opened at 6 in the morning, 7 days a week. 91 years of uninterrupted operation, according to the laminated sign bolted above the register inside. Today was Thursday. The clock on the dash read 8:14 a.m., and the door was locked and the pumps were cold, and Rook had not moved. Mace opened the truck door and stepped out into the November air. It came in off the ridge hard and flat, carrying the smell of creek water and dead leaves. He zipped his field jacket to the collar and crossed the lot, gravel popping under his boots. Rook turned his head once to look at Mace, then turned back to the door. "What is it?" Mace said quietly. The dog pressed his nose to the gap at the base of the door. "If this story stays with you, consider subscribing and turning on the bell. Stories like this one need to be heard." Mace put his hand to the glass and shielded his eyes. The interior of Harkin's Fuel and Feed was dim. The coolers along the back wall hummed their blue light. The display rack of motor oil and windshield wiper fluid stood in its usual place beside the register counter, and behind the counter, at the base of the far wall below the cigarette rack, there was a shape on the floor that should not have been there. He tried the door. Locked. He went around the side of the building to the service bay entrance, and that door gave when he lifted on the handle, something the old man had never bothered to fix. Inside, the smell hit him before his eyes adjusted. Not rot, not gas fumes, just something old and close and still, the smell of a room that had been breathing too quietly for too long. He went through the bay and through the interior door into the shop, and he found Harlan lying on his back behind the counter, one arm folded across his chest, the other stretched out at his side with his fingers resting against the base of the register cabinet, as if he had reached for it and simply not gotten there. Mace knelt. Harlan was alive. His chest moved, shallow and slow, but it moved. He called for an ambulance. Then he unlocked the front door and let Rook in, and the dog crossed the floor quietly and lay down next to the old man without being told to, and Harlan's hand, still and loose on the linoleum, moved once in the direction of the dog's flank. That was how it started. Harlan's full name was Harlan Joseph Dubeck, and he had run the station for 61 years, beginning when his father, Edward Dubeck, handed him the keys in 1963 and drove north to visit a sister and never came back down. The station had been Harlan's life in the particular way that a life and a place could become the same thing, each shaped by the other over decades until it was impossible to say where one ended and the other began. He had married a woman named Ruth in 1967. She had died in 2009. He had a daughter, Connie, who lived in Phoenix and called on Sundays when she remembered, and sometimes Thursdays when she felt guilty. He was 86 years old, and he had fallen the previous evening around 9 o'clock while reaching for a box of receipt tape on the top shelf behind the register. His hip had broken on impact. He had lain on that floor for 11 hours. The paramedics said the dog almost certainly saved his life by morning. Mace rode with Harlan in the ambulance to Corrigan Falls General. He was not sure why. He sat in the front with the driver and kept his hands in his lap and listened to the sounds from the back and thought about the way Harlan's fingers had moved toward Rook. That small, involuntary reaching. The way the body will still try to find something warm, even when the mind is somewhere else entirely. He was not a man who attached himself easily to things. 16 years in the Marine Corps had reinforced an instinct he had been born with, the instinct to keep moving, to leave each place a little bit before it got too settled in his chest. 2 combat deployments to Helmand Province. 2 years of disaster relief coordination in Louisiana after the floods. A posting at Camp Lejeune that he had ended himself by resigning his commission at 41 and pointing his truck toward no particular destination and driving. Rook had been with him for 4 years. A military working dog, retired from service 6 months before Mace was, a shepherd that had spent 3 years in the same operational theater and come home carrying the same kind of quiet that Mace recognized in himself. They had been good company for each other. Neither one required much explanation. The truck he drove was a 1998 Dodge pickup, dark blue, with 172,000 miles on the odometer and a sleeping bag in the bed and a box of paperback novels behind the seats. He had been drifting south along the ridge country of eastern Tennessee for 3 weeks, stopping at motels when the cold came in hard, camping when it didn't, filling up at stations and diners and letting each morning decide where the road went next. He had stopped at Harkins the first time because the pumps were cheap. He had come back the following week because Harlan had given Rook a piece of beef jerky through the window without being asked and said, "Good dog," the way a man says it who has known good dogs, without performance. The third time he had stayed for coffee and found himself talking about Helmand Province, which he did not generally do with strangers. Harlan had listened without inserting himself, which was also not a common thing. The fourth time was Thursday morning, and the door was locked and Rook was already at the glass. At the hospital, a nurse named Sandra Tull told him Harlan was in surgery for his hip. She asked if he was family. He said no. She said she would have him notify Harlan's emergency contact. He said the emergency contact was a woman in Phoenix named Connie, and that she should be called right away. Sandra looked at him for a moment with an expression that he recognized, the expression of a person trying to place a stranger in a story they hadn't heard yet. And then she wrote something down and thanked him. Mace drove back to the station. He sat in the lot for a while with the engine off and looked at the building. It was a modest structure, the kind that had been built in a time when gas stations were still full service, when a man pumped your gas and checked your oil and washed your windshield, and it all cost about the same as a cup of coffee does today. The canopy over the pumps had weathered to the color of old bone. The office window had a crack in the lower left corner held with a stripe of electrical tape. The bay door had a rust streak running down from the handle, like a long brown tear. It needed work. That was obvious. What was also obvious, though Mace did not say it aloud, and did not let himself fully form the thought yet, was that a man who had just had his hip broken on the floor of his own business at 86 years old was not going to be opening this station again in the near future, and probably not alone. He went inside through the service bay and locked the interior door behind him. He turned on the lights. He put a sign in the window that said, "Closed until further notice," and put Harlan's name on it, and then he sat down behind the counter on the stool the old man used and tried to figure out what to do next. Rook lay on the mat near the door and watched him. Connie Dubeck called the station's landline at 11:30 that morning. Mace answered it because it was the only number on the paper taped to the wall above the register that said emergency contact. She was a woman of approximately 50, to judge by her voice, and she was frightened but trying not to show it, and the first thing she asked, after Mace explained the situation, was whether the station was secure. "Yes," he said. "Is anything missing?" "Not that I can tell." A pause. "Who are you exactly?" "A customer," he said. "I found him." Another pause, longer. "I can't get there until Saturday," she said. "I have to arrange a flight and get the kids sorted." He said that was fine. "You'll stay until then?" He hadn't planned on staying until then. He had not planned on staying at all. He looked at Rook, who was looking back at him with the particular quality of attention the dog brought to moments of decision, ears forward, head level, like a compass needle waiting for the hand to stop moving. "Yes," Mace said. He stayed for 2 nights in the station, sleeping on the couch in the back room that Harlan had used for breaks, a worn green thing with a crocheted blanket draped over the back. He found food in the small refrigerator beside the couch: half a block of sharp cheddar, a carton of eggs, a container of homemade soup with a masking tape label that said Beef Wednesday. He ate the soup cold and felt like he was borrowing something that hadn't been offered. In the evenings, he walked the perimeter of the property with Rook, getting a sense of the place the way he had been trained to get a sense of things, methodically and without assumptions. The property was a 1/4-acre rectangle, the station at the front, a small storage shed at the back with a rusted hasp, a chain-link fence running the south side, and along the north side a narrow strip of ground that had once been a garden and was now mostly dormant grass and one stubborn climbing rose that had given up climbing and was spreading sideways along the fence rail instead. What he noticed, walking that perimeter, was the fuel delivery records tacked to the corkboard inside the bay. He had not been looking for them, but they were there, visible on his first pass through, and something about their pattern caught his eye. The last 3 delivery invoices, covering a span of 14 months, were from a company called Summit Petroleum Affiliates, not from the regional distributor whose name appeared on the older stack of invoices above. The pricing on the Summit sheets was noticeably higher per gallon, and the payment terms had shifted. The old invoices showed net 30. The Summit invoices showed something called automatic draw, with a footnote that referenced an account authorization form. Mace did not see anywhere on the board. He took the 3 Summit invoices down and set them on the counter. He was not an accountant. He was not a lawyer. He was a man who had spent 16 years reading terrain, noticing what was out of place, and acting on the information before the situation got worse. The invoices were out of place. On Friday morning, he drove to Corrigan Falls General and found Harlan in a room on the 3rd floor, propped against pillows with his hip braced and his color better than it had been on the floor of the station. An older man, 86 years carrying their weight, plainly in the loose skin at his throat and the white of his brows and the careful way he held his hands, as though everything was a little breakable now and he had learned to account for it. His eyes were clear, dark and precise, and still fully in the room, which was more than Mace had hoped for. Mace put the invoices on the tray table. Harlan looked at them for a long moment without touching them. "Where'd you find those?" "On your board in the bay." The old man was quiet. Then he said, "Sit down." The old man told the story in the measured, plain way of a man who had told himself the same thing enough times that the words had worn smooth. 14 months ago, a man from Summit Petroleum Affiliates had come to the station with a proposal. Better pricing, he said, if Harlan signed a supply exclusivity agreement. Harlan had read it, or tried to. The language was thick, the print was small, and the man from Summit had been patient and friendly, and had brought a tin of cookies that Harlan later fed to a neighbor's dog. Harlan had signed. Within 2 months, the pricing had climbed. Within 4 months, it was 10% above the regional average, and buried in the contract, in a clause Harlan had missed or not understood, was an automatic debit authorization tied to the station's operating account. Every Thursday, a draw came out. Amount variable, described in the contract language as logistics and infrastructure assessment fee. Harlan had called Summit's number twice. He had been transferred 3 times each call and had not spoken to a person who could explain the fee. The 3rd time he called, the number had been updated and the new one went to a voicemail box that was full. He had not told Connie because he did not want her to worry. He had not told anyone because he was 86 years old and had spent his whole life fixing his own problems. And the idea of being the kind of man who needed help with paperwork felt like the first step toward becoming the kind of man who needed help with everything. He looked at the invoices on the tray table and then looked at Mace. "You a lawyer?" he said. "No. You seem like you're about to do something." "I'm thinking about it," Mace said. Rook, who had been lying under the chair, lifted his head at the sound of Harlan's voice and pressed his nose against the side of the bed rail, and Harlan reached down slowly and laid his hand on the top of the dog's head and left it there. "He found me," Harlan said. "Yes. 11 hours. That's what they told me." The old man nodded once, a small economical nod. "My father used to say," he began, and then stopped and looked at the window. He started again. "He said some things only work right when someone decides they're worth working for." The sentence stayed in the air between them for a moment. Mace picked up the invoices. He spent Friday afternoon in the Corrigan Falls Public Library, using the computer at the reference desk because his phone signal was unreliable in the valley. Summit Petroleum Affiliates had a website, professionally designed and mostly content-free, listing a Knoxville address and a contact form and a general philosophy statement about partnership and regional energy access. The Tennessee Secretary of State's Business Registry listed the company as active, registered 3 years ago, with a registered agent named Bruce Candler of Candler Management Solutions, which had the same Knoxville address. He looked up Bruce Candler. There was a civil case in Hamilton County from 2 years prior in which a fuel distributor had sued Summit Petroleum Affiliates over a contract dispute. The case had settled. The terms were not public. He found 4 other small businesses in eastern Tennessee that had signed supply agreements with Summit, including a feed store in Granger County, a marina in Polk County, and 2 service stations in Bradley County. He found a post on a small business owners forum from a woman who identified herself as the owner of the Bradley County station, saying that the automatic draw had taken nearly $19,000 over 10 months before she had managed to close the account. The post was 8 months old and had no replies. He printed everything. The librarian, a woman named Greta Solis, who was somewhere in her early 60s and who had the quiet efficiency of someone used to helping people find things they didn't know how to look for, asked without preamble if he needed help. He said he might. She sat down next to him and looked at the printed sheets and said, "This is the same company that took out a lien on Emmett Poole's tire shop 2 years ago and then disappeared when his nephew got a state attorney involved." "You know about them," Mace said. "I know about most things that go wrong in this county," she said, not unkindly. "The question is whether you're going to do something about it or just have a stack of paper." He looked at her. She had the eyes of someone who had been asking that question for a long time and was accustomed to people choosing the stack of paper. "I'm going to do something about it," he said. What he did was call a number that Greta found for him, the Tennessee Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. He spoke with a man named David Trent, a staff attorney who had a careful, unhurried way of talking that Mace recognized as the verbal equivalent of a careful, unhurried way of reading. He described the situation. He faxed the invoices. He faxed the forum post, the Hamilton County case record, and a summary he wrote himself by hand on the back of a library print-out sheet, 1 page, numbered, factual. David Trent called back in 40 minutes. He said Summit Petroleum Affiliates was already on the division's radar. He said the materials Mace had provided, particularly the automatic draw clause and the pattern of businesses across multiple counties, were consistent with an ongoing pattern they were developing a formal case around. He said the records would be added to the file. He said Harlan needed to close and freeze the business account immediately before the next Thursday draw, and that a cease and desist would be sent to Summit's registered agent within 72 hours. Mace wrote everything down. Then he called the hospital and asked for Harlan's room and told him what to do about the bank account. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What did they already take?" Mace looked at his own notes. Based on the invoice pattern, he estimated around 14 months of variable draws, averaging between $800 and $1,200 per week. He said approximately $50,000, though the bank records would give the real number. Another silence. Longer. "I see," Harlan said. "The Attorney General's office will pursue recovery. There are other businesses in the same situation. It's a pattern." "That's what they call it?" "Yes." $50,000, Harlan said. The way a man says a number that he already knew somewhere and is only now allowing himself to hear it out loud. "We'll get it back," Mace said, and he was mildly surprised to hear the word "we," because he had not planned to use it. Connie Dubeck arrived Saturday morning, a woman of 52 with her father's dark eyes and a nervous habit of checking her phone that she seemed not to notice herself doing. She rented a car at the Knoxville airport and drove the hour and 40 minutes to Corrigan Falls, and went to the hospital first and came to the station second, sometime around noon, when Mace was replacing the weather stripping on the service bay door with a roll of foam tape he had found in the shed. She stood in the lot and watched him work. "You're the man who found him," she said. "Yes." "And you've been staying here?" "Yes." She looked at the station. Then she said, "I've been telling him for 3 years he should sell this place." Mace kept working. He didn't reply. "He won't," she said. "He'd die here first." She said it without bitterness and without sentiment, just as a statement of her father's character. "I live in Phoenix. I have kids in school. I can't move back." "No one's asking you to," Mace said. She looked at him. "He needs someone to run this place while he's recovering. A hip at 86, that's 4 months minimum before he's on his feet. Maybe more." "I know." She looked at the station again, the weathered canopy, the cracked window with the electrical tape. "Can I ask what you're planning?" Rook was lying in the service bay doorway behind Mace, watching Connie with the steady, evaluating attention he brought to new people. He was not tense. His ears were forward, and his posture was neutral, which in Mace's experience meant something. "I was planning to keep moving south," Mace said. "Were," she repeated. He pressed the new weather stripping into place along the bay doorframe and held it while it set. He thought about the way Harlan's hand had moved toward the dog on the floor of the station at 8 in the morning after 11 hours of darkness and cold linoleum. He thought about the invoice board and the automatic draw and the woman on the form whose post had no replies. He thought about Trent's careful, unhurried voice and the word pattern, and the fact that a man who had run one honest business for 61 years had been taken for $50,000, one Thursday at a time. He thought about the climbing rows along the north fence rail that had given up climbing and started spreading sideways instead, and how that was sometimes what survival looked like, finding the direction where the progress was possible, and growing that way instead. "There's a diner in town," Mace said. "I noticed it when I drove in." Connie looked at him, not sure where this was going. "Do they serve lunch?" She said she thought so. "Come on," he said, and he picked up the roll of foam tape and set it on the shelf inside the bay and nodded for Rook to follow. Greta Solis met them at the diner by accident, which was the kind of accident that did not feel entirely accidental in a town of 4,000 people, where a librarian had spent 20 years paying close attention. She was eating a bowl of vegetable soup at the counter, and she saw Mace come in, and she shifted one stool to make room. The diner was called Parrish's, and it was run by a man named Dale Parrish, who was in his late 50s, heavy-set and calm, with a white apron and hands that moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had been cooking for other people for a very long time and had made his peace with it. He brought coffee without being asked and set a bowl of water on the floor for Rook without commenting on the health code implications, which Mace appreciated. Greta told Connie about the Hamilton County case. Connie's phone stayed in her pocket for the whole conversation, which Mace took as a sign that she was more genuinely worried than she had let on. Dale leaned on the counter and listened and said, "There's at least 2 people I know in town who signed agreements with that company. Marcy Olson at the coin laundry, and the fellow who used to run the auto parts place before he closed." "Closed why?" Mace asked. "Said his margins went bad about a year in. Blamed it on competition at first." Dale refilled the coffee cups. "Might have been something else." Greta said the Attorney General's division had a consumer fraud hotline, and that she could put together a notice for the library bulletin board, which was where people in Corrigan Falls still got a significant portion of their practical information. Connie said she would post in the county Facebook group. Mace said he would call the Attorney General's office in the morning and mention the additional businesses. They sat in Parrish's for 2 hours. Outside, the sky lowered and the temperature dropped, and by the time they left, the first snow of the year was beginning to come down, light and exploratory, the flakes small and dry, the kind that precede a real storm by a day or two, feeling out the territory. Mace stood on the sidewalk and looked up at it. Rook shook the snow from his ears and pressed against Mace's leg. Connie stood beside him. She pulled her coat tighter. 4 months, she said. "That's what the doctor said minimum." "I heard you," Mace said. "You'd need to run the pumps. He has 2 part-time people, but they're both in school. They can't manage it alone. I know how gas stations work. It doesn't pay much. I don't need much." She was quiet for a moment, watching the snow come down on the street, on the cars in the diagonal lot, on the porch rail of the old courthouse across the square. "Why would you do this?" she said, not accusingly, genuinely asking. He thought about it. "I'm not sure yet," he said, which was honest. She looked at him for a long time, then she nodded. "The back room has a couch." "I know," he said. "I slept on it." He reopened Harkin's Fuel and Feed on Monday morning at 6 o'clock. He replaced the bulb in the sign above the entrance that had been dark on one side, and swept the lot and restocked the cooler from the delivery that came Tuesday, and learned the register from the printed cheat sheet Harlan had taped to the side of the monitor years ago and never taken down, a set of handwritten instructions for a machine that had long since become second nature to him, but that he had written down anyway, the way a careful man records the things he knows so that someone else can know them too. The 2 part-time employees were students from the community college, a young woman named Beth and a young man named Craig, both in their 20s, both relieved to find the station open and operating under someone's supervision. They were good workers, honest and straightforward, and Mace gave them clear schedules and stayed out of their way when they were working and asked questions when he needed to learn something new, which he did not find difficult because he had spent 16 years in an institution that considered learning a survival skill. Harlan's regular customers came back within the first week. Mace noticed that several of them paused at the counter to say something, usually brief, usually in the direction of the empty stool, as though they were addressing someone who wasn't there yet. A farmer who came in every morning for coffee and a scratch ticket said on Thursday, "Harlan doing okay?" without any preamble, as if continuing a conversation. "Hip surgery went well," Mace said. "He'll be back." The farmer, who was somewhere in his 70s and wore a seed corn cap with the brim bent at a perfect curve, looked at Mace and then at Rook, who was on his mat near the door. "Good dog," he said. "Yes," Mace said. The bank confirmed the account freeze on Tuesday. On Wednesday, Trent called to say the cease and desist had been served to Summit Petroleum Affiliates' registered agent, and that the company's attorney had contacted the division office. He said this was consistent with what happened when a pattern case developed real traction. He said Harlan's claim, combined with the records from Bradley and Granger and Polk counties, gave the division enough to pursue disgorgement proceedings, which meant there was a reasonable path to recovery of the funds. Mace wrote it down. He drove to the hospital that afternoon and told Harlan. The old man was sitting up in the bed, which was progress. He had a crossword puzzle on his tray table and a pair of reading glasses on the end of his nose. He listened to the full report without interruption, which Mace had come to understand was Harlan's equivalent of paying close attention. When Mace finished, Harlan set down the crossword. "You find the room comfortable?" he said. "Well enough?" "That couch is old. The springs are gone in the middle. I keep meaning to replace it. I've slept worse." Harlan looked at the window. The light was going. It was past 4 o'clock, and the winter dark came early and fast in the valley. "My father left me that station, with nothing but the keys and a handshake and $14 in the till," he said. "I've always wondered what he'd think of how it turned out." 61 years, Mace said. "I think he'd have a pretty good idea." Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're not just passing through anymore." It was not a question. Mace looked out the window at the early dark coming down over the ridge. "No," he said. "Not exactly." He drove back to the station and cooked a can of chili on the small burner in the back room and fed Rook his dinner from the bag in the cab of the truck and sat on the green couch with the crocheted blanket across his knees. The station was quiet the way stations are quiet after close. The refrigerators cycling, the light above the register still on, the lot outside empty and gray under the single pole light. He was not certain when it had shifted. These things rarely had a clean moment in his experience. It was more like the way ground thaws in spring, not all at once, not because anything dramatic happened, but because enough warmth had accumulated in enough places that one morning the frost was simply gone. He had stopped thinking about the route south. He had started thinking about the bay door's alignment, and whether the fuel pricing was correct, and whether Harlan's insurance would cover the replacement of the sign panel above the canopy. He had started using the word "we." The following 6 weeks moved at the pace of a station that was finding its rhythm again. The Summit Petroleum matter moved through the Attorney General's division with the deliberate institutional speed of a process that was real but not urgent. And Mace reported each update to Harlan during his twice-weekly hospital visits. And then, as December came and the hip healed enough for limited mobility to the rehabilitation facility on the east side of Corrigan Falls, where Harlan had been transferred. Greta posted the consumer fraud notice at the library and wrote a short piece for the county weekly that ran without a byline, but that Mace recognized by its precision. 3 additional business owners contacted the Attorney General's office in the following 2 weeks, which Trent noted in a phone call was going to have material impact on the scope of the disgorgement proceedings. Dale Parrish sent breakfast to the station twice a week, delivered by his 16-year-old nephew on a bicycle with a handlebar basket. Mace tried to pay for it the first time. Dale refused. They did not discuss it again. The farmer in the bent-brimmed cap, whose name was Ray Pruitt, and who had farmed the same 200 acres east of town since his father handed it over in 1981, started coming into the station a few minutes later each morning, as though accounting for a conversation. He talked about his fields, his equipment, the particular misery of a cold diesel engine in November. He never mentioned Harlan directly, but he asked the kind of questions that people ask when they are monitoring something they care about through a proxy they have decided to trust. Beth said one evening, straightening the display rack near the door, people were worried the station would close. "It's not closing," May said. "We know that now," she said. "That's different from before." He understood what she meant. Connie called every Sunday and sometimes Thursdays. The calls had shifted in tone from the first one, that frightened assessment call in November, to something more like updates between people managing the same situation from different distances. She had spoken with the station's insurance carrier about modifications for when Harlan came home. She had arranged a visiting nurse through the county. She was looking at flights for Christmas. "He asked about you," she said, "on the first Sunday of December." "What did he say?" "He asked if you were eating. I said I had no idea, and he said, 'Tell that man to eat the soup in the refrigerator.'" "The soup is gone," Mace said. "I ate it in November." A pause. "He's going to like that," she said. The morning Harlan came home from the rehabilitation facility was the 14th of December, a Saturday, cold and bright with the kind of winter sun that gives no warmth, but takes nothing away either, sharp and high and honest. Connie drove him. She had flown in the Friday before and stayed in the back room on the green couch, and Mace had slept in the truck, which was fine. Mace had cleaned the station thoroughly and opened it that morning at 6 as usual, and then left Craig in charge at 8 and driven to the facility to be there when they brought Harlan out in the wheelchair to the car. He had not planned to be there. He went anyway. Harlan came through the facility doors and saw the truck in the lot, and nodded once, as if he had expected it. They rode in convoy back through Corrigan Falls, Connie's rental in front, Mace and Rook behind. Main Street was hung with lights, green and white, strung between the utility poles the way they had been strung for 40 years in this town. The same pattern, the same poles, the particular comfort of a thing that simply happens every year without anyone deciding to do it. Harlan's house was a quarter-mile east of the station, a white frame house with a covered porch and a metal roof and a vegetable garden in the side yard that had gone to frost but would come back in spring. The visiting nurse was already there when they arrived, a practical woman named Jo, whose manner reminded Mace slightly of a good staff sergeant, which he meant as a compliment. They got Harlan inside and settled in the front room in the recliner that had been placed there for the purpose, and Rook went in without invitation and lay down beside the chair on the braided rug, and Harlan looked down at him for a long moment. "Same dog," Harlan said. "Same dog?" Mace said. Harlan reached down and put his hand on Rook's head and left it there. The Attorney General's division filed formal disgorgement proceedings against Summit Petroleum affiliates in January. Trent called to tell Mace the filing included 8 businesses across 5 counties and that the aggregate claim exceeded $400,000. He said the timeline to resolution was uncertain, but that the pattern documentation was strong. Mace thanked him and relayed the information to Harlan that evening over supper, which he had taken to having most evenings in the white frame house because Harlan cooked better than he did, and because the alternative was the back room of the station, which he had resumed living in, and eating alone. 400,000, Harlan said. 8 businesses, Mace said. Harlan was quiet. He served himself the navy bean soup he had made that morning, slowly, with the deliberate economy of someone relearning the physical logistics of his own kitchen. "You know what my father would have said," he said. "What?" "He would have said, make sure somebody gets their money back." "That's the idea," Mace said. Harlan looked at him across the table. "You planning on staying through winter?" Mace looked at his soup. He thought about the route south, the highway that had been waiting for him since October, the motels and diners and mornings that had not yet decided anything about themselves. "Through winter," he said, and did not put an end on it, and Harlan did not ask for one. Rook was under the table, pressed against Mace's boot. Outside, snow had come in off the ridge while they ate. Real snow this time, the accumulating kind, covering the vegetable garden and the metal roof and the street in front of the house. The pole light at the corner caught the flakes on their way down and made them briefly bright before they disappeared into the white below. It was the kind of quiet that settled at the edges of things first, then worked its way in. Mace listened to it. He had spent 16 years learning to read the quality of silence, because in his experience, silence was never just the absence of sound, but the presence of something that hadn't spoken yet. Some silences meant waiting, some meant danger, some meant the long, specific aftermath of an action that had used everything up and left only the clean fact of what remained. This silence was the last kind. He could not have said, sitting at that table with his soup and the old man across from him and the dog at his boot, exactly when the decision had been made, or whether it had been made at all in any single, recognizable moment. It felt more like something that had been made slowly, one day at a time, one choice at a time, the way a place becomes a place, not because someone declares it, but because enough things happen there that matter, and enough of them matter to you specifically, until one night you are sitting in the light of it, and the road south is still out there, somewhere under the snow, and you find you cannot locate the urgency to find it. He had stopped in this valley because the pumps were cheap. He had stayed because a dog had known before he did. There are people in this world who arrive at the moment they were needed, before they know they were needed, and who leave before the story tells them why they came. And there are people who stay, not because they planned to, not because it was comfortable or obvious, but because something in them recognized something in a place or a person that said, this is where the work is, and the work is real, and you are capable of it. You know the difference. You have felt it. That pull between the road and the place that is asking you to remain. Most of us spend our lives negotiating that pull, moving when we should stay, staying when we should go, trying to read the signal in the noise of our own restlessness. The story of Harlan Dubeck and a station that should have been closed is not a complicated story. A man built something for 61 years. Someone tried to take it from him quietly and over time, the way that kind of taking works, invisibly and by degrees until the damage is done, and the paperwork is signed and the account is empty. And another man passing through found the door locked at 8 in the morning, and a dog that would not leave it. The dog knew first. He usually does. May God bless you, keep you, and give you the wisdom to recognize the door you are supposed to open and the courage to go through it when the time comes. Take care of one another out there.